The clink of glasses had barely faded when my father rose towering above the tables with a smug grin plastered across his face. My stomach twisted. I had seen that expression before, usually before he cut me down in front of relatives at Thanksgiving dinners, but never on a night like this. He tapped his glass with a spoon, demanding silence, and the chatter fell away. For a moment, I prayed he might surprise me with grace. Instead, his voice rang out sharp as broken glass. "Don't clap for her. She's nothing but a leech in white milking pity pretending she belongs here." The air was sucked from the room. My aunt gasped audibly. A cousin whispered, "Oh my God," as forks froze halfway to plates. The band's violin squealed into silence, the bow suspended mid-string. And then, because cruelty never arrived alone with my father, he twisted the knife. He gestured toward my groom and sneered. "Your mother would roll in her grave if she saw you wasting your life on her. At least your brothers made me proud. She was a mistake the day she was born." It was a line so vicious that even the children at the far table stopped giggling and stared with wide eyes. One little boy turned to his mother and whispered, "Why is Grandpa so mean?" My face flamed hotter than the chandeliers above, and I felt 200 sets of eyes burning into me, pitying, judging, horrified. I swallowed hard, but before I could react, my father did what he had always done, escalated. He lifted his glass, swirling the deep red wine like a mock performance. My groom squeezed my hand, steadying me, and raised his own glass with steady defiance. "Tonight," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the hush, "we celebrate not only love, but the legacy she carries forward with honor." And that was when my father spat. He leaned forward and sprayed his mouthful of wine onto the polished floor at our feet. The liquid splashed like blood, spreading in a jagged stain between us. Guests gasped. Chairs scraped as people recoiled. The smell of bitter wine wafted up like something rotten. My father chuckled a dry, hateful sound and said, "See, even the floor rejects her. Nothing she touches will ever shine." The stem of his glass cracked against the table as he slammed it down, shards scattering like cruel confetti. A woman near the back muttered, "This is disgusting." A man whispered, "He's gone too far." But my father only leaned back, arms crossed, wearing the smugness of a man who thought humiliation was sport. I trembled, my throat tightening, but inside something shifted. This wasn't just another wound to carry in silence. This was exposure. Everyone saw him now, the man behind the mask, the cruelty laid bare. My groom didn't release my hand. He looked directly at my father, his voice steady. "You may spit your wine, but you cannot erase her worth. She inherits dignity, and that is something you'll never understand." The crowd stirred again, a different murmur now. Anger, sympathy, recognition. My father's smirk faltered. His jaw tightened. The room was no longer celebrating his authority. It was recoiling from it. As the wine spread across the floorboards like a bleeding wound, I realized something profound. It wasn't my shame staining the night. It was his. The silence after his outburst was suffocating, the kind that presses against your ears until you hear nothing but your own heartbeat. The guests shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between me, my groom, and my father, as though unsure whether they should stand up for me or stay frozen in their chairs. Somewhere near the dessert table, a server dropped a tray, the clatter ringing like an exclamation mark on the humiliation that had just unfolded. I wanted to crumble, to sink into the floor, but my groom wouldn't let go of my hand. His grip was steady, his knuckles white, and I felt the strength of his silence before he even spoke. He turned to my father, his voice low, but carrying through every corner of the reception hall. "This is supposed to be a celebration, a union, a night where love speaks louder than old grudges. But instead, you've chosen to shame your daughter." He paused, locking eyes with him. "No, not chosen. You've rehearsed this, haven't you? Like every time you've cut her down." The words landed like a gavel. Some guests stirred, nodding faintly. Others pursed their lips, the pity in their eyes shifting to outrage. My father sneered, leaning back in his chair, as if to say he was untouchable. "I don't need to rehearse the truth," he said coldly. "The truth is, she's nothing without my name. Nothing without my money." The mention of money was deliberate, and I saw the way some relatives stiffened. He wanted to remind everyone of the inheritance he controlled, the legacy he hoarded like a weapon. My groom's jaw flexed, but his voice stayed calm. She doesn't need your name. She doesn't need your money. What she has is dignity. What she has is me. And together we'll make a life that no amount of bitterness can touch. A ripple of murmurs spread through the hall, louder now, charged. A woman at the front table whispered fiercely, "Good for him." Another voice answered. Finally, someone said it. My father's face flushed, his arrogance cracking for the first time. I stood rooted, my chest heaving, but in that moment I understood something. For years, his power over me came not just from his cruelty, but from the silence it created, my silence, and the silence of those who watched and said nothing. Tonight, that silence was breaking. Every gasp, every whisper, every nod in the crowd was proof. His humiliation was no longer mine to carry alone. My father slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the silverware. "You think these people care about you? You think their pity means you're worth something. You're a parasite. You'll never inherit what I built." The words hung heavy, laced with venom, but they also revealed more than he intended. It wasn't just about me. It was about control, about legacy, about the fortune he guarded like a dragon over gold. I saw the shift in the crowd as they processed his slip. My father had turned the night from a cruel toast into a confession. He wasn't just mocking me, he was admitting to everyone that the inheritance was his weapon, that his love had always been conditional on obedience. The betrayal was no longer hidden in the shadows of our home. It was exposed in chandeliers and candlelight witnessed by every pair of eyes in the hall. My groom lifted our joined hands high, his voice resonant. "Then let it be known tonight she doesn't inherit your scorn. She inherits her mother's dignity, and that is worth more than every dollar you've tried to chain her with." His words weren't shouted, but they struck with the weight of a verdict. The guests erupted not in cheers, but in something heavier, more powerful. A collective gasp, then the scraping of chairs as people stood. Not all, but enough. Friends, cousins, even a few older relatives who had once stayed silent now rose to their feet, their expressions grim, defiant. They weren't saluting like soldiers, but their standing was a statement just the same. They would not sit complicit in his cruelty. My father's smirk finally faltered. His eyes darted across the room, scanning the faces of those he thought he controlled, only to find them slipping from his grasp. He muttered something under his breath, gripping the edge of the table as though it could anchor him. But it was too late. The tide had turned, and he knew it. I felt my knees weaken, my heart pounding, but for the first time in years, I wasn't drowning in shame. I was breathing in vindication. And though I hadn't yet spoken a single word, the crowd had already heard the truth. My father was no patriarch, no protector, no guardian of legacy. He was just a bitter man stripped bare by his own cruelty, standing in a room full of witnesses who would never look at him the same way again. The clinking glasses and fractured silence of that wedding hall faded from my ears as my mind reeled backward, yanked into the shadows of my childhood. His words, "parasite," mistake nothing. Without my name, were not born that night. They were echoes of every cruelty that had shaped my life since I was a girl. If the guests thought this was a shocking revelation of who my father really was, they didn't know the half of it. I was 7 years old the first time I learned what it meant to be invisible in my own home. It was Christmas morning the year my mother was still alive, frail from illness but trying to hold our family together. I tore the wrapping paper from a box beneath the tree and discovered a second-hand puzzle, its cardboard edges already frayed. My brothers, on the other hand, unwrapped brand-new bicycles with bows as bright as fire trucks. My father clapped them on the shoulders, pride gleaming in his eyes, while my mother squeezed my hand under the table and whispered, "I'm sorry, sweetheart." I smiled for her, but the truth burned in my chest. I had already been written out of his script for love. By the time I was 10, my father no longer bothered to hide his contempt. One humid July afternoon, my brothers were whisked off to baseball camp in matching uniforms, their laughter echoing from the driveway as Dad loaded their gear into the truck. I stood barefoot on the porch, holding the book I had won in a school contest, hoping he would notice. He glanced at me only long enough to sneer. "Books won't make you worth anything. At least the boys will carry on the family name." Then he slammed the door, leaving me standing in the heat, with nothing but my mother's fading smile to comfort me. At 13, the year my mother's illness worsened, I begged him to take me to the hospital after school so I could sit by her bed. Instead, he dropped me at home with a list of chores. "Your brothers need a clean uniform for their game," he said flatly. "You can keep busy with that." I folded laundry while she lay dying, and the shame of that still presses heavy on me. The night she passed, I found out hours later because he hadn't even called me to the hospital. My brothers were there. I was not. That absence would become the story of my life. At 16, graduations approached. I had worked harder than anyone, pouring myself into essays and projects, desperate to prove I wasn't just the mistake. When my name was called as class valedictorian, I scanned the crowd, searching for even the shadow of his face. He wasn't there. He was across town at a minor baseball game, cheering until he was hoarse for my brother who hadn't even started on the team. That night, while polishing my medal, I overheard him mutter to a relative on the phone, "She's smart, sure, but it doesn't matter. She's not the son I wanted." The words lodged like glass in my throat, unshakable even years later. After my mother's death, the cruelty sharpened. He remarried quickly, a woman who treated me like a stray to be tolerated until she could shove me out the door. Together, they carved the house into two worlds, theirs filled with laughter dinners and plans for the future, and mine a narrow corner of existence where I was tolerated but never embraced. My stepmother once tossed my duffel bag onto the porch before a family vacation and said, "Sorry, no room for extras." They drove away without me, and when neighbors asked why I wasn't along, my father shrugged. "She doesn't fit in." Abandonment became routine. Birthdays, forgotten holidays, erased milestones ignored. By 18, I realized waiting for him to acknowledge me was like waiting for rain in a drought. I packed my things and left for college with no money from him, no blessing, no guidance. I worked double shifts in diners, studied until dawn, and learned to stitch a life together without his support. But even distance couldn't sever the barbs of his betrayal. He used inheritance as a leash, dangling it over me with comments like, "Behave," or "Don't expect a penny when I'm gone." What he didn't know was that my mother had once quietly promised me that a portion of her estate, her savings, her jewelry, the house her parents left her, was meant for me. She wanted me protected even if he didn't. After her death, those assets vanished into his control. He never spoke of them, never admitted they existed. I suspected he buried them under paperwork and technicalities, convincing the world they were his alone. That suspicion became certainty one winter when I returned home for the last time. I had found an old letter from my mother tucked inside a book she once gave me. In her handwriting, faded but steady, she wrote, "What I leave behind is for you. Don't let anyone take it away." My hands shook as I held those words, and when I confronted my father, his eyes went flat. He smirked and said, "You think you deserve anything? You're not my heir, not my bloodline. You're nothing." And then he walked away, leaving me standing in the cold kitchen with my mother's ghost and the weight of a stolen legacy. Every slight, every abandonment, every betrayal had built to this. So when he spat wine on the floor of my wedding, when he declared before all those witnesses that I was worthless and would never inherit, it wasn't a spontaneous cruelty. It was the mask slipping the private daggers he had wielded against me, finally thrown in public view. But what he didn't realize was that his arrogance had cracked open the very secret he had buried, and that secret would be the key to his undoing. Leaving that house at 18 felt like tearing a bandage from a wound that had never healed. I carried one battered suitcase, a scholarship letter, and the faintest echo of my mother's voice telling me to keep going. My father didn't come to the bus station. He didn't call. He didn't even pretend to care. He was too busy praising my brothers for their athletic scholarships, calling them the real future of the family. For me, the door closed with a finality that still rang in my bones. College was survival. While my peers went home for Thanksgiving with overflowing cars of groceries and hugs, I stayed behind, working double shifts at the diner just off campus. I poured coffee for truckers at 2 a.m., scrubbed sticky tables until my hands cracked, and studied under flickering fluorescent lights. Some nights, the exhaustion was so heavy I fell asleep in my uniform, grease still clinging to my hair. But each small victory, an A on a paper, a bill paid on time, a kind word from a professor felt like a stone laid on a foundation I was building all by myself. There were moments of crushing loneliness when I wondered if my father had been right, if maybe I really was worthless without his name, his money. But then I would remember my mother's letter, her insistence that what she left was meant for me. That letter became my anchor, the proof that at least one parent had believed in me. I taped a copy of it inside my desk drawer, and whenever doubt gnawed at me, I read her words until I could breathe again. By 22, I graduated with honors. I stood on stage in my cap and gown hearing the applause of strangers, but in the crowd there was no family. My father hadn't come, and I hadn't expected him to. Instead, I looked into the flashing camera of a classmate's parents and smiled as if they were my own. Later that night, my landlord slipped me a note with my rent receipt. "Proud of you, kid." It was the smallest gesture, but it lodged in my chest with more weight than anything my father had ever said. That was the moment I began to understand family isn't defined by blood, but by actions. I rented a shoebox apartment and began working as an assistant at a small firm. The office was cramped, the walls yellowed from years of neglect, but to me, it was freedom. I filed papers, fetched coffee, and stayed late to learn everything I could. My boss, a sharp-eyed woman named Karen, saw something in me. She pushed me harder, gave me responsibilities beyond my title. And once, after I solved a particularly thorny case file, she patted my shoulder and said, "You've got grit. Don't lose it." Those words meant more to me than my father's approval ever could have. Life moved forward. I built friendships with people who showed up when it mattered. On birthdays, they baked me cakes with uneven frosting. On bad days, they sat with me on the floor of my apartment eating cheap takeout and reminding me I wasn't alone. Bit by bit, they became my chosen family. And then came the day I met him. My groom, the man who had stood beside me in that wedding hall and refused to let my father's cruelty define me. We met at a networking event of all places, me clutching a plastic cup of watered-down punch him, cracking a joke about how these gatherings felt more like endurance tests than professional opportunities. We laughed, talked, and within an hour, I felt a strange lightness as if someone finally saw me not as a shadow but as a whole person. He never asked about my father, not at first. When the topic inevitably came, he listened without pity, only quiet fury on my behalf. "That's not a father," he said flatly. "That's a tyrant." And when I tried to shrug it off to minimize it as I had all my life, he stopped me. "You don't need to excuse him. His actions speak for themselves." For once, I believed it. We built a life together slowly, deliberately, with none of the shortcuts my father always claimed were necessary. We saved for our first home, celebrated small wins, and learned to carve joy out of ordinary days. I would catch myself waiting for the other shoe to drop for betrayal to find me again, but he always steadied me. He showed up when the car broke down, when work deadlines crushed me, when I doubted myself. His consistency healed me more than grand gestures ever could. Meanwhile, I learned to stand taller in my career. I took on projects others avoided, negotiated with clients who underestimated me, and refused to back down when colleagues questioned my worth. Each success was another quiet rebellion against the narrative my father had written for me. I was not a mistake. I was not nothing. I was building something real, brick by brick. But the shadow of inheritance never disappeared. My father sent letters occasionally, thinly veiled threats about who would inherit what, reminders that I was cut off. "Your brothers will know how to honor me," he wrote once. "You'll have nothing." I stopped reading after that. I filed the letters away, a collection of his cruelty evidence of the power he thought he still held. What he didn't know was that I had already started digging quietly, methodically, with the help of my mentor, Karen, and a trusted lawyer friend. My mother's assets had not vanished. They had been buried, and one day I would bring them into the light. So when my groom slipped a ring on my finger and we began to plan our wedding, I carried not just excitement, but a secret resolve. This would not just be the start of a marriage. It would be the moment I stopped letting my father write the ending of my story. The letters my father sent weren't just cruel, they were careless. Each one, filled with venom, also revealed the obsession that consumed him: control of the family estate. He had always treated wealth like a crown only he could wear, and my exclusion wasn't just punishment, it was strategy. But cruelty leaves traces and arrogance breeds mistakes. It started with an offhand remark at a family gathering I reluctantly attended before cutting contact altogether. My stepmother bragged about renovating the lake house with funds that didn't add up. That house had belonged to my mother's parents, a place she used to take me as a child to escape his temper. I remembered my mother once whispering, "This will always be yours." Yet now it was being gutted without my knowledge claimed as my father's project. Something twisted inside me that night, a mix of grief and rage. I turned to Karen, my mentor, and confided what I suspected. She didn't flinch. Instead, she slid a business card across her desk. "Call him," she said. It was a lawyer she trusted, a man named Harris who specialized in estate disputes. "If he's hiding something, Harris will find it." At first, I hesitated. The thought of digging into my father's lies terrified me. But Harris was meticulous, and within weeks, he uncovered discrepancies. Bank transfers in amounts just below reporting thresholds. Property titles altered with suspicious timing. A trust fund my mother had established in my name, never dissolved, never mentioned, redirected quietly under my father's control after her death. The evidence was there, buried under layers of arrogance. I remember sitting in Harris's office, the papers spread across the polished wood desk like a map of betrayal. My mother's signature on documents, her handwriting fading beside my father's forged editions. "He thought no one would look," Harris said, tapping the page. "But your mother was smarter than he realized. She left protections. She made sure you had a claim." And he buried it. The weight of those words nearly buckled me. For years, I had believed his narrative that I was nothing, that I had no right to anything, that I was disposable. But here was proof ink stamps, signatures that my mother had thought of me, had fought for me even in her absence. The inheritance wasn't about money. It was about dignity, validation, and justice. I carried those copies home, hands trembling. My groom sat with me on the floor as I spread them out. He listened while I explained, his jaw tightening with every revelation. Finally, he said, "Then we won't hide this either. When the time comes, the truth will speak louder than his lies." That time came sooner than I expected. My father's cruelty escalated in the weeks leading up to the wedding. He called distant relatives, warning them I was manipulative, a gold digger unworthy of their respect. He sent another letter, this one more brazen. "Don't expect me to show up at your circus. If I do, it will be to remind everyone who you really are." My stomach churned when I read it, but I tucked the letter into a folder labeled Evidence. The night before my wedding, I lay awake, the papers heavy in a box at the foot of the bed. My groom reached for my hand. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" he asked. I thought he meant the vows, the promises, the start of a marriage. But I knew he also meant the confrontation. "Yes," I whispered, though fear knotted in my chest, because I knew my father would come. Not to bless, not to witness, but to destroy. He had rehearsed his cruelty my entire life, and he wouldn't miss the grand stage of my wedding. What he didn't know was that I had rehearsed too. I had prepared not just for vows, but for truth. The papers traveled with me to the venue, tucked safely in Harris's briefcase. He attended as a guest, but his presence was a shield. My chosen family sat scattered among the tables, friends, mentors, people who had lifted me when I had no one. They didn't know the full weight of what might unfold, but they knew enough to stay close. When my father rose during the reception and spat wine at my feet, when he sneered about money and inheritance, the moment crystallized. He thought he was humiliating me. He thought he was declaring victory. But in truth, he had just opened the door I had been waiting to walk through. His arrogance had given me the stage to reveal everything he tried to bury. I saw Harris shift in his seat, eyes narrowing as if waiting for my signal. My groom caught my glance, gave the faintest nod, and squeezed my hand. The crowd's murmurs swelled. My father slammed his fist on the table, ranting about legacy heirs and bloodlines. And in that fury, he confirmed before everyone the very thing he had always denied, that the inheritance mattered more to him than love, more than family, more than me. I inhaled deeply, steadying myself. The papers in Harris's briefcase might as well have been burning with anticipation. The truth wasn't just on our side, it was ready to be unleashed. And as the guests leaned forward, waiting for what would happen next, I realized something vital. For years, I had been the silent child, the invisible daughter. But not tonight. Tonight my father would not be the only one with a voice. Tonight justice would rise louder than his scorn. The air inside the reception hall had already turned sour after his first outburst, but when my father leaned back, lips curling into that smug sneer, I knew he wasn't finished. He had always saved the sharpest knife for last. He rose again, ignoring the uneasy shuffle of guests in their chairs, and clinked a fork against his shattered glass as though demanding the floor once more. "You can all stand there pitying her," he said, his voice thick with scorn. "But don't forget everything worth inheriting belongs to my sons. She will leave this night with nothing but that dress which she didn't even pay for herself." The gasp that rippled through the crowd was immediate. My bridesmaids stiffened at their table. A cousin muttered, "That's enough," and my stepmother smirked as if this had all been planned. My father spread his arms, soaking in the silence. "I built this family. I built this name. He jabbed a finger toward me, is nothing more than a guest in a life she didn't earn." I felt the sting of tears, but my groom squeezed my hand, anchoring me. He stood tall and unflinching and addressed the crowd rather than my father. "It's true that tonight is about inheritance," he said, his tone deliberate, drawing every eye. "But not the kind he believes. Tonight, she inherits her mother's dignity, her courage, and her legacy, and that cannot be stolen." His words landed like a strike of lightning. The room hummed with whispers, people shifting, leaning closer. My father barked a laugh, ugly and raw. "Legacy, don't fool yourself. I buried her mother's legacy years ago. It was mine to take, and I took it. She has nothing." He didn't realize it, but in his arrogance he had confessed. The crowd heard it clear as day. A murmur surged louder, angry, disgusted. One woman near the front turned to her husband and whispered, "He admitted it. He stole from her." That was the moment Harris, seated at a side table with his briefcase, rose to his feet. He was calm, methodical, the way lawyers often are when they know they're holding a winning hand. "Actually," he said, his voice cutting across the room, "you did not." Heads turned, gasps followed. My father's face drained of color. Harris snapped open the briefcase, pulling out neatly organized files. "Your late wife's estate was never yours to claim in full. She left protections you thought you could bury. But I assure you, they've been found." The room erupted in chaos, guests whispering, shifting, some standing outright. My father's voice cracked as he tried to shout over them, "Sit down! You don't know what you're talking about!" But Harris was already walking forward, placing documents onto the head table, sliding them across the linen like evidence in court. He tapped the signatures, the dates, the notarized stamps. "Her legacy lives here in black and white, and by law, by her will, it belongs to your daughter." The silence that followed was electric. My father's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. He looked around wildly, searching for allies among the guests, but the faces staring back were no longer loyal. They were horrified, angry, betrayed. Even his sisters, once complicit in his silence, turned away, refusing to meet his eyes. My groom picked up the papers, holding them high so everyone could see. You all heard it from his mouth. He mocked, he spat, and he admitted his theft. But this, he shook the pages gently, is the truth. Tonight, justice isn't hidden in shadows anymore. The crowd reacted not with applause, but with something heavier, a collective murmur of vindication. People rose from their seats one after another until half the hall was standing. A distant relative muttered, "I always wondered why she was left with nothing." Another said louder, "Now we know." My father slammed his fist on the table so hard the silverware jumped. "You think a few pieces of paper will change anything? This is my family, my money, my legacy." His voice cracked on the last word, desperation bleeding through. I stood then, finally finding my voice after years of silence. My hands trembled, but my words were clear. "You're wrong. Legacy isn't something you hoard. It isn't a weapon to use against your children. Legacy is built on love, on protection, on actions that last longer than money. And you failed at all of it." My voice grew stronger as I spoke, fueled by the presence of witnesses who finally saw him for who he was. "You abandoned me, betrayed me, stole from me. But tonight you can't hide it anymore. Tonight everyone knows." The gasp that followed was not pity, it was recognition. My words weren't just my truth anymore. They had become the truth of the room. My father's face contorted with rage, but beneath it I saw something else: fear. Fear of the law, fear of exposure, fear that his empire of silence had collapsed in one night. He reached for his stepwife's arm, but she pulled away, ashamed. He shouted, "This is a lie, a conspiracy!" But the documents were still on the table, his confession still echoing in the hall. Harris leaned forward, voice calm but cutting. "You can deny it here, but you won't deny it in court. These documents will be filed first thing tomorrow." That was the breaking point. My father roared, shoving his chair back, but the guests had already turned against him. Some booed, others muttered disgrace, and a few shook their heads with disgust. One by one, they began to walk out, leaving him standing in the wreckage of his own cruelty. I looked around the hall at the faces of people who once whispered doubts about me, now burning with indignation for what had been done. My groom wrapped an arm around me, steady and warm. For the first time in my life, I felt the weight shift. The shame that had always been mine to carry had been laid squarely at his feet where it belonged. He tried to speak again, but no one listened. He was no longer the patriarch, no longer the man in control. He was just a bitter figure, exposed, stripped of power, staring at the legacy he tried to bury, now rising like fire around him. And as the crowd filed out, leaving him isolated at the table he once ruled, I realized this wasn't just a confrontation. This was a reckoning. The days after the wedding did not feel like the dreamy haze of a honeymoon. They felt like the first moments after a storm, branches scattered air thick with the scent of something broken, but also finally clean. My father's humiliation had played out in front of 200 witnesses, and the fallout came swiftly. By Monday morning, Harris had filed the documents. The estate court clerk stamped them with a heavy thud that seemed to echo louder than any toast from that night. The evidence was irrefutable. My mother's assets had been siphoned, my inheritance buried, my rights trampled. The copies of my father's forged transfers, his arrogant letters, his own confession at the wedding, they formed a case stronger than steel. Word spread quickly in our community. Relatives who once looked down on me called their voices thick with guilt. "We didn't know," one aunt whispered over the phone. "We thought you were exaggerating." I listened in silence, not out of cruelty, but because I no longer owed them reassurance. The truth spoke for itself now, and for once I didn't have to. My brothers tried to intervene, but even their voices faltered. One called me defensive at first. Dad was just drunk. He didn't mean it. But when I reminded him of the forged documents, the trust fund diverted, the property gutted for renovations, his tone shifted to pleading. "Please don't take this to court. It will ruin him." I answered simply, "He ruined himself." Then I hung up. The legal battle unfolded with grim inevitability. Harris presented everything in meticulous detail, laying out the timeline of theft and betrayal. My father's lawyers blustered, but the evidence silenced them. When the judge asked my father directly if he had redirected funds meant for me, he muttered something about protecting the estate. The courtroom fell into the same silence that had filled the wedding hall, a silence that damns more than any shout. The ruling came faster than expected. The court recognized my rightful inheritance, froze his accounts pending investigation, and ordered restitution. But beyond the legal victory, something larger had shifted. My father's reputation, once carefully cultivated as a pillar of strength, a man who built everything, collapsed. Neighbors whispered. Old friends crossed the street to avoid him. His name, once a weapon he wielded over me, became a stain he couldn't scrub away. For the first time, the power dynamic reversed. He called me voice hoarse, demanding I stop the process. "You're destroying this family," he rasped. I let him finish, then answered calmly, "You destroyed it long ago. I'm just cleaning up the wreckage." His silence on the line was longer than any argument. Then he hung up. He never called again. My stepmother, who once smirked as my duffel bag was thrown onto a porch, left him within weeks. I heard through cousins that she packed her things in the middle of the night, muttering about not wanting to sink with a drowning ship. My brothers distanced themselves too, not out of loyalty to me, but out of fear of association. He was alone, the patriarch reduced to a bitter man in an empty house, his empire of control scattered like ash. And me. For the first time, I breathed without weight pressing on my chest. The wedding photos arrived, and though some captured the chaos, the wine stain, the tension, others showed the truth. I wanted to hold on to me and my husband smiling through it all, surrounded not by blood, but by chosen family who stood when it mattered. I framed one of those pictures, placing it on my desk beside my mother's letter. Her words and that image told the same story. Legacy is not what is taken, but what is carried forward with dignity. I began setting boundaries with clarity I had never known. I changed my number, blocked his calls, and made peace with the silence. I no longer needed to wait for scraps of approval. The inheritance restored to me was more than money. It was validation proof that my mother had loved me enough to fight for me even after death, and that justice, though slow, could still arrive. Yet the true consequence wasn't in the courtroom or the bank accounts. It was in me. For years, I had been the invisible daughter, the one left behind, the one erased. But standing there in court, hearing the ruling, watching the truth crush his arrogance, I knew I had stepped out of that shadow forever. News of the case spread beyond family. A local paper ran a small feature framing it as a story of inheritance, justice, and resilience. Strangers reached out, sharing their own experiences of betrayal of parents who had stolen or abandoned. Reading their words, I realized my story wasn't unique, and in that I found unexpected comfort. We were many carrying scars that finally saw light. The aftermath wasn't just his downfall, it was my beginning. My husband and I used part of the inheritance to buy a modest home, not grand, but ours. I planted roses in the yard, each bloom a reminder of growth from thorn. We invited friends for dinners, filled the rooms with laughter, and slowly rewove what family meant. I didn't dance on his ruin. I didn't celebrate his isolation. I simply let it exist, the natural consequence of a man who chose control over love, power over protection. Justice had spoken, but more importantly, so had I. For the first time, my voice was louder than his shadow. The spring after the court's decision, I found myself standing in a sunlit room I never thought I would own. It wasn't extravagant white walls, creaky hardwood floors, a kitchen that still smelled faintly of fresh paint, but it was ours. The deed bore my name, untainted by his control. For the first time, a roof over my head did not carry his shadow. My husband and I walked through it barefoot that first evening, laughing the windows open to let in the scent of lilacs from the yard. I remember thinking, this is what freedom smells like: flowers and paint and air that isn't heavy. The inheritance, once a weapon he had wielded against me, became a tool of healing. I didn't squander it on things to prove my worth. I used it to build the life my mother had wanted for me, stable, safe, rooted in dignity. Part of the funds went into a scholarship in her name, dedicated to young women who had been told by their families they would never be enough. The first recipient, a shy 17-year-old who dreamed of becoming an architect, wrote me a letter. "Your story gives me courage. Thank you for believing in me, even though we've never met." I cried when I read it, not because of her words, but because they echoed what my mother must have hoped I would one day feel: that love and legacy can ripple outward, healing even those beyond your reach. Boundaries became my quiet revolution. I didn't send invitations to holidays. I didn't answer calls from unknown numbers. When relatives tried to mediate, urging me to forgive for family's sake, I asked calmly, "Family is built by actions. Tell me what actions he ever took to be family to me." Silence always followed. Forgiveness, I learned, wasn't about opening the door to him again. It was about releasing the hold his cruelty had on my heart, and in that release, I breathed easier. Healing didn't happen overnight. There were mornings when I woke from dreams of him spitting wine, my chest tight, my hands clenched. There were dinners where a certain laugh in the crowd made me flinch, thinking of his sneer, but each time I grounded myself in the life I was building. Roses in the garden, dinner with friends who showed up not out of duty, but out of love. My husband's steady presence, his arm always ready around my shoulders. Slowly, the past became just that, the past. My father faded from the community he once ruled. I heard whispers, his business partners dropped him, his house fell into disrepair, his calls went unanswered. I didn't check on him, didn't send messages, didn't feed the part of me that once longed for scraps of acknowledgement. He became a ghost I no longer needed to chase. Some might call that harsh. To me, it was necessary. Healing sometimes means leaving the wound behind, not revisiting it. One quiet Sunday, I visited my mother's grave. I brought lilies, her favorite, and the first printed copy of the scholarship brochure bearing her name. Kneeling, I placed it gently against the stone. "We did it," I whispered. "Your legacy lives." They tried to bury it, but it grew instead. The breeze stirred, carrying the scent of flowers, and for the first time in years, I didn't cry from grief. I cried from peace. Years later, when I held my newborn daughter in my arms, I understood legacy in its truest form. It wasn't money or property. It wasn't a name carved into stone. It was the love you pass forward, the protection you give, without condition, the dignity you teach your children they deserve. Looking at her, I promised silently, you will never doubt you are wanted. You will never wonder if you belong. You will inherit not my scars, but my strength. Our home became a gathering place for the family we chose. Friends around our table, laughter echoing against the walls, birthdays remembered with cakes that leaned slightly to one side. Holidays spent with warmth instead of cold silence. That was family. Not the blood that betrayed, but the actions that sustained. When people asked about my father, I no longer felt the sting of shame. I simply said, he taught me one lesson what family should never be. And then I smiled, because what he tried to destroy had only made me stronger. His cruelty gave me clarity, his betrayal gave me boundaries, and his downfall gave me justice. The rest I built myself. To anyone watching, to anyone who has felt invisible in the eyes of those who should have cherished them, I say this: blood does not define you. Betrayal does not bind you. Legacy is not stolen wealth or a family name. Legacy is what you choose to create. I chose healing. I chose love. I chose family by action, not by blood. And in that choice, I finally found peace.